not even technically tea because it's herbal tea, which means it's more of an herbal infusion rather than tea itself. But we just colloquially call tea whatever we steep on hot water, and it's not coffee. I was once at this festival. Tea actually has a very interesting history as an afternoon ritual in many countries, as a drink to have in ceremonies. And I attended this tea festival once here in the city a few years back, probably somewhere in 2014, sometime in 2014, and it was full of very different. It was full of booths with different vendors from around the state or the tri-state area, and they had many options, and a lot of them were not actually tea; they were herbal teas. But it was a very tasty experience. I got to taste a lot of different teas, and after going around all the booths, there were talks and workshops, and I got to walk into this talk about tea history. There was this very nice tea historian who was talking about an area that also overlapped in her expertise, which was women's studies and history of tea, given that she had learned about the different ways in which the tea had become part of an afternoon ritual we know as afternoon tea. And of course, tea was a very expensive import, and a given time in Europe, it started off as a trendy custom amongst European aristocrats, and it later on started to permeate down the social ladder until it became pretty widespread as an everyday affair for a lot of people, especially upper middle class women, as the tea and the imports of tea started to become more affordable to people of all walks of life. And so in England, tea has a very interesting history, of course, because it is very deeply ingrained with the economic and the political history of the country, and it is to this day a very an upheld everyday institution, and a very good way to keep warm in cold days like tonight that I just went off for a walk to the park, and it's actually pretty chilly, so that's why I added some Campane root to my tea, which is supposed to help either loosen my sinuses or loosen my pussy, whatever bits that come out of your nose. Anyways, so tea also had a very big impact on the lives of. I'm gonna take a sip, please. It is gonna go cold. Tea has a very interesting history, and had a very big impact in the lives of middle class and even working class women in Britain, because as the trend of tea raged on, there became a lot of economic activity associated with teas. People would of course would have their tea with pastries, so it's also deeply associated with the history of sugar and the affordable sugar that started to come in from the sugar colonies, and of course even the history of slavery. But just sticking to what was going on in Britain, so the afternoon tea started to become ingrained in the lives of everyday people, especially middle class people who were hosting tea at their homes. Of course, people didn't really go out to pubs to have a cup of tea, and people didn't really. It was an activity that became very associated with the opportunity of women to socialize. There weren't all that many places where you could go out and dine out back in that day. I don't think it was even a custom, but you were supposed to be able to host different guests and reinforcing a lot of social connections. Instead of networking, I guess people were just trying to socialize and mingle a little bit to, and in order to host, even middle class households would be able to host, although sometimes you would need extra help, a tea lady or a tea service, in order to entertain this additional volume of work that entailed just to be there to properly prepare the tea. Tea can also be, of course, you can overcook tea. You can overboil it. Back then, it was still customary to have whole leaves in your tea in order to brew it, and the freshness and the quality of the tea leaves was very important back then. We didn't have tea blends yet. So what we know nowadays as tea blends and all those things like English breakfast or Earl Grey, which are really fancy and really give us very rich and aromatic profiles these days, are sort of a byproduct of tea recycling, which means that in the early days of the tea rage, you would have this whole tea leaves in order to brew your tea, and it was also indicative of very good access to high quality tea. So you wanted to show off these traits, and the best households would have the best, prettiest, freshest whole tea leaves as part of their supplies for their tea. But as a lot of housekeepers and tea service ladies would engage in the trade, they had access to the leftovers of some of the best teas from the poshest or the bushiest households that could afford this first very expensive import, and therefore they would engage in this tea recycling, which means that you would take sometimes these used tea leaves that were not so whole anymore. They would start breaking off into bits and pieces, and then they would be able to host their own events or host further events from the aristocratic households. They could recycle some of the leaves and they would bring it that over to the middle class households, and the tea would get recycled down the social ladder, but would start taking on these traits because people also realized at one point, I don't know who, but they started roasting the used tea leaves in order to get further flavor and aromas from the tea, and especially after the tea started to break off into bits, and the tea leaves started to break off into bits and pieces. So initially, tea blends were just a natural consequence of having to recycle and sometimes roast the tea leaves, and also blending them into desirable tastes or smells. And I don't know really when people came up with the classic or the famous blends we have nowadays, the famous ones, but and this tea recycling was also very important as a way to make a supplementary income for the housekeepers and the tea ladies that were engaged in this. It was their gig, I guess. Well, Japanese tea is a little bit different because, of course, the Japanese have a very high regard for the tea ceremony. So, as much as it is important as a social setting to engage in some affairs, family affairs, and business affairs, for the Japanese ritual of tea, you have the tea ceremony. And the tea ceremony is a way to honor your guest and show deep respect for them. Because I once went to this tourist tea ceremony in Kyoto, Japan, and this tea is actually quite bitter. And of course, in Japan, you're having a form of Japanese matcha green tea that is essentially green dried leaves of green tea. And when you compare it to the way we like to serve tea in the West, not only do they not sweeten the tea, they try to prepare it extra strong. The way that you steep matcha green tea for a tea ceremony is that you add in hot water to your powdered matcha, and you have to shake it with a special bamboo instrument that allows the cook or the preparer to extract as much as of the aromas and I guess the essential oil out of the tea. So I was first thinking about the history of tea and how deeply ingrained it is in the stories and the mythos that we tell ourselves about the American Revolution and how it actually got started. And if you remember well, the story goes essentially that the British were forcing the American colonists to buy this hefty amounts of tea, and also heavily taxing the tea. And in the story, you have a very picturesque picture of American colonists and American revolutionaries dressing up as Amerindians in order to dump these imports of tea into the ocean because they were being heavily taxed and forced to buy this import as a tax itself, which I guess it's a very good symbolism for the rejection of a British imposition on the Americans of that time. In reality, the main driver for the American Revolution back then was the fact that they were also being heavily taxed through the stamp tax. So we can blame tea as much as we want because it's very picturesque and it makes for a very good posters or makes for a very good story. But of course, after the American Indian Wars in the back then British colonies, the British Crown had incurred in a lot of, and Parliament had incurred in this very great expense, providing all these troops for the defense of the colonies against the American American native nations. Now, the stamp tax was actually the first instance in which the British Crown was directly taxing American colonists, and they didn't have a representation in Parliament. So Americans were like, no taxation without representation. And that also comes to shape the nature of American democracy to this day. We can be reassured that people actually kept drinking tea in the Americas and in the United States because British-American relations resumed very quickly after the independence, and therefore became the closest commercial partners until the 19th century.